Baptist Church. We're excited to host you guys tonight. I'm not a pastor here. I'm the secretary. I work in the office, and both of our pastors are out of town. One is in Tennessee at the conference, the Sin Conference. The other is in Minnesota with family. So you guys are stuck with me. So welcome. If you guys need restrooms, if you take this hallway, men's and women's are on the left. If those are full, you can take our this hallway and go to our education wing. There's some restrooms back there as well. So so glad to have you guys here tonight, and thank you for coming. And I will turn it over to the Dugal.
Thank you. We are indeed glad that you are here. Did we cut it off? I don't know. But there are some chairs, so you guys are not going to have to stand. There are some up here on the front. But Matt has said he will pull some out of the closet just in case you don't want to come all the way to the front. So we are glad you're here. We had 96 people I know for sure that registered. Several have called or emailed or done various things to let us know you were coming. The most important thing was just so we would know how many people to set up for. So we are glad you're here. To my knowledge, we have churches represented here tonight from 4 of the area associations. There may be others. And one Free Will Baptist church with us tonight. So that associated with our communities. We're glad you're here. This is an important topic. And Brian, so I'd say Brian Matthews is not going to be, that's not the right Brian that I'm introducing. Brian Davis from the Baptist State Convention of North Carolina is going to be coming and dealing with this very important topic to us that we need to listen in just a few minutes. Let me give a little bit of housekeeping. Somewhere on the tables, and you can pass it back and forth until you've filled it out, there is a clipboard with a registration form, and if you'll put your name, your email address, and your church in, and then there's a column, particularly, it was put there particularly for Cullum and Flat River, because you do not have a director of missions at this particular time. If you would like to receive information that we might get as follow-up about this and other topics, then just click that you want that. Some of you already get it, so. And then I will go ahead and make one other statement before I introduce Brian. But make sure that you fill this out and look around you and share and just get it back and forth. And we uploaded, or Meredith rather, uploaded all of the information that are templates and things that Brian will be making reference to tonight in his presentation. So we would encourage you to go to our website. They're on the scrolly thing that's across the front page. And then we'll be adding some stuff as we get additional information as well. But please go ahead and feel free to do that. And he can give you if there's any stipulations about it on that as well. We are trying to both record it, audio, and record it video. So if you have a question of Brian or anything, please try to talk up clearly so that others who cannot be here tonight will be able to post it somewhere so that they can get it. So at this time, I'm going to introduce to you Brian Davis, and I may have said Williams or Matthews or anything else as I've gone through this, but Brian Davis, he is with the Baptist State Convention of North Carolina, and this, I believe, is about his 10th one of about 20 of these events that are scheduled across North Carolina. So he's happy to be with you tonight, I think, because he lives in Wendell and you're not in Morgan. So, Brian, if you come, my friend.
Thank you, Dugal. I appreciate that. And let me say, you'll see me look at my phone. I'm not checking my text messages. That's where I have my notes. And you'll appreciate that I have notes, but I try to stay because I want to be a good steward of your time. I know it's been a long day for a lot of you. You've been engaged in ministry today and a variety of other pursuits, and I appreciate you giving your time to come and be a part of this conversation. Let's begin with a word of prayer together. Father, we come before you this evening, so very thankful that, Lord, we have full confidence in you. So very thankful that when we may not be certain what to do, we know at least to whom we should turn. And so, Father, we come before you crying out to you to give us wisdom and to give us discernment, not only in the issues we're going to discuss this evening, but in the larger commission that you've given us to be about the business of making disciples. And Lord, I pray that as we walk through this conversation tonight, that at the end of the conversation, we will realize that what we're dealing with is larger than policies, larger than bylaws and constitution, that we really are dealing with our sense of purpose and our mission, more importantly, the Great Commission, and that is indeed the making of disciples. So Lord, I pray that you would bless our conversation. Lord, give us eyes to see and ears to hear all that you have for us. Speak to us through your word and through your spirit, we pray now. We'll make our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, let me go ahead and give the disclaimer that I always have to give. I'm Brian Davis from the Baptist State Convention. I'm the Associate Executive Director Treasurer. Unlike many of you, I'm a preacher type. I am not an attorney. I am not an accountant. So you're going to be tempted to ask me questions and say, well, I want to get a good legal opinion. I cannot give you a good legal opinion outside the fact that one of my responsibilities is to work with our convention legal counsel. And what I'm going to be reviewing with you tonight is much of what we have discussed in taking a legal review of this issue and trying to prepare material that will be of assistance to the congregations across the convention as they're wrestling with the issues that we're going to be discussing tonight. So I'm certainly glad to help you to walk through these things, but there may be some matter of legal technicality that you wish to get more detail on, and I'm glad to run that back through our counsel. And you may want to speak to your own as well. But we're going to look at some of the larger principles that frame this conversation, where we think that we're focused on the issue of same-sex marriage, but really the discussion and the implications are much broader than that. Let us frame our discussion, if we can, from Paul's words to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1, verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but what He's given us? A spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. And that really is not only the foundation for what I'm going to be sharing with you this evening, it is the framework by which we are needing to approach this whole conversation. For example, we'll begin with the first thing that Paul told Timothy. God's not given us a spirit of fear. Before June 26, the government of this land could not force any minister to bury, baptize, extend the Lord's Supper, or marry anyone that you did not feel compelled to do those things with. And nothing has changed after June 26. The problem is there are groups out there that are wanting to scare pastors to death and trying to convince them that everything has changed. I'll give you a good example. In the days immediately following the verdict of the Supreme Court to validate same-sex marriage, a story appeared online. It was a fake news site. It was a false story. But it took on a life of credibility that it did not deserve because Christians, and mainly a lot of pastors, shared it, posted it, tweeted it, got this story out there and gave it a credibility it didn't deserve. And what was the story? Well, it was very simply the supposed action that a minister in Vermont, and you got to remember I'm from West North Carolina, we say Vermont, but from Vermont, refused to perform a same-sex wedding. Well, the problem is it was presented on a website that looked like NBC.com, but it was not. If you paid attention to the URL, it was a fake website. The name of the pastor that was involved is a name that gets circulated and recirculated along several of these fake websites. Paul Horner was the guy's name, and Paul Horner's name gets attributed to all kinds of fake news. This time it was thrown in, supposedly, that he was a pastor. And then really what was, to make insult to injury, if you read the article, which was apparent many did not, Paul Horner supposedly was a pastor of a for-profit church in Vermont. There is no such thing as a for-profit church. But sadly, that story, that false news story, got credibility it did not deserve because in our fear, far too many Christians who were afraid that's coming down the line saw the very first rumor of that, took it, gave it credibility, and it spread like wildfire. Now, I know nobody in this room did that. I'm certain nobody fell for that here. I pray you didn't. Because a lot of folks that shared that story added comments to it like this: that's the end of religious liberty. Or the sky is fallen. Or that was the first shot across the bow. And all kinds of statements that just further to scare and to stir more fear among people. And so it's important that we realize God did not give us a spirit of fear. So if God didn't give it, where does fear come from? Well, it comes from the pit. It comes from hell. It comes from that very literal place where the adversary, where Satan himself dwells. And so if you're afraid, or people are trying to make you afraid, God's not giving you that. That's coming from the adversary. That's coming from Satan himself. But it's important that we understand, if God's not given us a spirit of fear, what has He given us? Well, let's go back to what Paul says. He's given us a spirit of power, love, and a sound mind. Now, I want you to think about power here for a moment. The governing documents for the church are the Scriptures. Now, sadly, our government doesn't recognize our governing documents, even though our government's governing documents are based on the philosophy that are espoused in Scripture. That's another message for another day. But the government does recognize that every nonprofit entity, that's including churches, has the power to establish its own policies and procedures. Every nonprofit entity has the power to determine how they're going to do, in a church's sense, its ministry. And so every church has the power to get its governing documents in order, to get its policies and procedures in order. And one of the places where we're finding there's a lot of need for a lot of attention for churches is regarding policies. Especially when we start looking at the use of facilities, weddings, and some of your personnel policies. Now, you may not be able to see this in its entirety, but let me make sure that you understand the descending layer of authority when it comes to governing documents. The most legally binding, if you are an incorporated entity, is what's called the Articles of Incorporation. Some organizations have what's called a charter. Those are the same documents. This is followed by the Constitution, then followed by bylaws, then policies, and then what we'll just call precedent. So, in order of descending authority, the most legally binding documents you have in the government's eyes, again, we're all agreed, the Scriptures are our governing document. But what the government recognizes is first Articles of Incorporation, followed by Constitution, then bylaws, policies, and precedent. What trips a lot of pastors up is they don't understand this important key point. If there is a challenge to a decision that a nonprofit entity makes, if there's a challenge legally to some action a church may have taken, here's what the court's going to be looking for. Okay? Do you have a policy or procedure or statement in the Articles of Incorporation about this matter? The Articles of Incorporation have very little in them. If you're incorporated, you can go to the Secretary of State's website, look under their corporation search, type in the name of your church, and if you're incorporated and if you've properly submitted your documents, your Articles of Incorporation are found there. So if you've ever lost them and you wonder where to find them, Secretary of State's office, free of charge, you can look that up. And you'll find there's only a couple of things in that document. Your name, where you're located, your purpose, the names of the incorporators, the fact that the authority is vested in the membership, and then usually a statement about what happens if you cease to exist, what's called dissolution. This idea of if the church dissolves, that your assets after your debts are paid are then transferred to another nonprofit entity. That's all you're going to find in the Articles of Incorporation, just those handful of big picture items. The bylaws then begin to get the framework for all your day-to-day things, but they don't include your day-to-day things. Your bylaws identify your committees, but they don't direct your committees how to do their work. Your committees should be directed by policies. Now, let me explain why this is important. You want in your policies things that need to be amended from time to time, things that need to be reviewed. Policies are easy to update. Bylaws are much more difficult to change, to edit, or to amend or review. Articles of Incorporation are very difficult to edit and review. So anything that requires regular or annual review, put it in your policies. Now, having said all that, watch what happens. Let's say that there's an issue about the handling of funds in the church, and there's a question whether funds have been handled properly. Okay? Look first at Articles of Incorporation. If there's nothing referencing the handling of funds there, the court will then look at the Constitution. If there's nothing there, then to the bylaws. If there's nothing there, then to the policies. Wherever the statement appears, that's where it's legally binding. So your policies are legally binding. Put things in your policies and they will protect your church. There are some groups out that are encouraging churches to go ahead and put things in their charter or their constitution or their bylaws related to use of facilities or marriage or membership, and we're discouraging you from doing that up front because this is an issue that's continuing to develop. And so you need to have it somewhere where you can easily edit it and amend it as the issue continues to develop. The other point is this: if you have things that are germane, i.e. financial matters, that are scattered through all the documents, and you ever have a problem, which one is going to trump the other ones? Again, you've got financial policies that says here's how the money should be handled, but you've got a few statements scattered in your bylaws, and you've got a few statements scattered in your constitution, and nobody's paid attention to those statements scattered about for many, many years, and now we've discovered when we have a problem, because it's never a problem until you have a problem. But a problem arises if we say, uh-oh, what we have in our Constitution doesn't agree with what's in the bylaws, it doesn't agree with what's in the policies. We're trying to maybe even discipline an employee based on policies, but the most legally binding document's not the policies, it's the Constitution. Or you may say, we're trying to follow the bylaws, but now you're telling us there's something in the Constitution that contradicts that. That's why we say, focus on your policies. Get your day-to-day things in policies. This is not the time to start making amendments or additions to your bylaws or your Constitution. Now let me slow down before we go further and see if you have just basic questions about this. Again, yes, there is a descending list of authority, but don't follow the trap that I want to put it in the most binding place. Put it where you can get to it, amend it, edit it, and leave it all in a policy. Don't scatter it about. Because if you put it all in policy and leave it on the policy level, it is legally binding at that level. Yes?
What about for an unincorporated church?
Great question. North Carolina General Assembly changed the law, corporate law, several years ago to say if you are an unincorporated entity, the court will still view you and treat you as an incorporated entity, meaning you must do everything decently and in order. You must have policies, you must have processes. You cannot just operate as a sole proprietorship or an LLC or these other types of organizations. You have to be well organized and conduct yourselves in a corporate fashion. So that means if you don't have any policies, and I'm finding lots of churches, this is a great time to review all your policies. But if you don't have any policies, you're just operating by, shall we say, oral tradition. You do that to your own peril. This is the time to get your policies in order, to not only make them clear, but to consistently follow them. The only thing worse than having no policy is having a policy that you ignore. That creates the contradiction that can get you in a lot of legal trouble if you have policies and refuse to follow them. Again, I mentioned a moment ago that there's some organizations out there that are trying to give you some magic words to drop in your bylaws. And the problem is, I'm not sure how many churches are represented here tonight, but I feel pretty good at saying there are probably no two of you that have bylaws that are written exactly the same. There's no way that any organization can write one paragraph that's going to fit in every church's bylaws and impact that church in exactly the same way. So that's why what we've done in convention, and what I'm glad to see others are doing, is they're putting together samples and templates for you to make sure that you develop policies that fit your gun. Because if it doesn't fit your gun and you try to cram it in, what happens? You're going to have a problem. It could be an explosive problem. So our goal is to give you some resources that you can shape and form into that which fits in your church's organizational structure. Because if it fits in your structure, then it will be legally binding. So whatever your process is for establishing church policies, you need to follow that same process for reviewing your facility use policies, your marriage policies, and any personnel policies you change. If you ignore your current process to establish these new policies, they probably are going to be invalidated if they're challenged. If you don't have any policies, understand that the process that you are about to follow will become the process you will need to follow as you establish all your other policies. Yes?
These samples of templates are available now or are being developed?
They are available. They have been available for almost a year now. Lynn Buzzard, who is a retired law professor at Campbell University, and I pulled these things together last fall and shared them even at our annual convention in November. Dr. Buzzard led a breakout session. A number of people attended that and received the templates. We've been continually sharing those with directors of missions and with pastors that request them. And this is a good time to make sure you know you have access to these templates and these samples in an electronic format. All you got to do is contact your director of missions, and we provided them these documents. They can get them to you, and you have all kinds of blanks you can fill in to make it fit your church. We've tried to make it just as simple as we can. You'll find there's lots of scripture that's included there. It's your place to determine which scriptures represent your church's conviction, and you include those. We've tried to give you lots of leeway to make it fit different leadership structures, whether you have deacons or elders or some other council that has responsibility for review. You can make it fit your church's leadership structure, and we hope that you will utilize those documents to help you in undertaking this task.
So, if I'm understanding you right there, if the church has something in there dealing with something in the Constitution or bylaws, it should be changed probably to state as seen in policies, so it addresses them back to the policy so that we can be changed as needed, but yet the Constitution's bylaws and stuff stays pretty much the same.
Yes, it's always a good idea for the Constitution or bylaws, one of them, to authorize the personnel manual, to authorize the procedures manual, to authorize whatever policy manuals you may have. And you may say that the church will do such and such in accordance to, as you stated, this policy manual. That's always a safe way of doing that. And again, it pushes the detail down here. Yes?
So how often are you recommending that the policies be reviewed? Are you saying, as right now, as an example, we're under the preparation for the annual budget, teachers and officers and that kind of thing. So do we present those policies yearly, or are we revisiting those policies as we have a problem? And then what is your advice on addressing it before an annual renewal cycle at the church?
Well, number one, certainly an annual review of all your policies is always in order. Now, the question is, do you want to roll that into all the other annual things that are taking place? You can schedule that annual review whenever you want to during the church year. You may do better not to try to roll that into a budget presentation, a church leadership presentation with all your Sunday school teachers and things of that nature. You may be better to do that at a different time of the year so things don't get lost in that larger conversation. But certainly if you want to do it all at one time of the year, you certainly have that freedom. Again, it's however your church is organized and however it approaches its task, that's the way you want to do that. But you've got lots of flexibility on when you review your policies, how you update them, or who you authorize to do it. The key is just make sure in the get-go, from the beginning, if you don't have a process, and if you don't have policies, the very first ones you do, get the church to affirm that so it gives you a good precedent and process to follow as you develop all the future policies.
Affirm what?
Affirm your process. For example, it may be that and I'll just give an example with, again, using a financial policy, because this is more than just one policy review. You need to look at all your policies. To say that the first time that the church adopts a financial policy for how funds are to be handled, that if there's never been one before, take that to the congregation in one of your regularly scheduled business meetings, get the affirmation of that, but make sure it's stated in that policy that this policy will be reviewed annually by whomever you want to give that responsibility to. Deacons, elders, some council, some board, and that entity will be authorized to update this on behalf of the church on an annual basis and report back to church what they've done. That way you've got somebody that has responsibility to do it and the authority to do it without having to call the church together to make a minute change in a policy. Does that make sense? And again, you have the power to establish the process that works for your church. No two churches have to do that the same. The key is just be consistent. Make sure that you're consistent. about the necessity for looking at policies for these initial and immediate concerns. Again, the initial and immediate concerns that we're seeing are primarily with use of facilities, i.e., who's going to use the facility for a reception for a wedding, to celebrate an anniversary, for things of that nature. Secondly, your wedding policy or wedding procedures. And then third, there are lots of churches that are interested in trying to place some statement about the expectations they have for their ministers as it comes to the issue of same-sex marriage. What I've given you are excerpts of 3 different policies. Please don't roll those all into one policy. And let me give you some practical reasons, and then we'll come back and talk about some legal reasons. Practically, when anybody comes to you to talk about a wedding, what you want to provide them is a simple statement of your wedding position, your wedding policy. You don't want to give them bylaws. They don't need to know how you elect your Sunday school teachers. They just need to know, here's how a wedding is going to be viewed and approached here by this congregation. When you put together this policy, make sure you put it together in such a way that it makes very clear what you are for, rather than trying to outline everything you're against. Give you an example of this. You're not going to think of everything. In 2011, when North Carolina was debating and preparing for this issue of the amendment related to our state's constitution on recognition of marriage, does anybody remember the language that was lifted up that we all voted on and gave consideration to? That the only domestic union that we recognized in North Carolina is between one man and one woman. And I remember hearing people say, you know, boy, this is some of the strongest language in the land. This is going to be hard to assail. And I asked a simple question, not trying to be smart, not trying to be disrespectful, but I asked the question, a man since when? And a woman since when? Now in 2011, I had some folks laugh at me when I asked that question. 2015, people aren't laughing about it. This whole issue of gender identity is the latest breaking part of the whole sexuality movement. Please understand, if you are only focusing on policies or procedures that deal with same-sex marriage, you're already behind. This issue has gone far beyond same-sex marriage. It has gone even beyond sexual identity. It is this whole issue of sexual expression that goes all beyond the bounds of Scripture. And so, with all due respect, please don't spend a lot of time trying to list all the sexual deviations you're against in your policy. You're not going to think them all up. And if you can, I'm worried about you. Let me remind you, how did Satan come onto the world scene? In the garden doing what? Twisting God's truth. Satan's never had an original thought. All he can do is twist God's truth. And when it comes to marriage, there's no new definition of marriage or no new expression of love that Satan has come up with. All they can do is twist and pervert what God created to be holy and pure. And so what we need to lift up in our policies is that which is holy and pure. Very simple. How are bank tellers taught to identify counterfeits? Do they study the counterfeits? Do they major on all the counterfeits? No, they focus on the real thing. They know the real thing so well that they can be moving at lightning speed through a stack of hundreds. And the moment they touch, it doesn't take they don't have to caress it. The moment they touch it, they know the real thing so well that the counterfeit automatically becomes apparent. That's what you want your policy to look like. You want it to lift up the real thing so much that if 2 men or 2 women came to your pastor and said, we want you to perform a wedding for us. Well, here's our wedding position. Here's our wedding policy. Let's sit down and talk this through. But they'll look at that and say, well, you know what? That's not us. But then the question is, what do you do after that point? That's for later in the presentation. Yes?
I hope this question is appropriate. Do we need to define what a man or what a woman is in our policy?
What I've been suggesting, just for simplicity, is to say a man as created by God and a woman as created by God. And that's from Scripture. God created them, male and female. Let's just keep lifting up Scripture. I don't think we can improve on that. And I think it will assail, it will stand against the assails that come from all the folks that are wanting to redefine and validate things. But great question. Thank you for that. Yes?
Let's say your church says to you, well, you can determine your own policies, Pastor.
Okay.
Do you think that's wise, or should you say, no, we should do this as a church? Rather than let the individual?
If the church has no policies, it's wise for the pastor to draw up this first one. Whether you title it the pastor's wedding position statement or a proposed policy, and let the church affirm it. That way it's in your records, it's in your minutes, that the congregation has affirmed it. That's an important part of all this. We want to keep it tied to the congregation.
And should they do that every time they receive a new pastor? Or should they have something in the policy saying that the pastor can determine his own policy? Is, I guess, kind of what I'm asking, or is that just too loose goose?
Well, again, depending on the organization and structure of the church, it may be appropriate for each pastor to come in and to present their language. But if that's the case, the church still needs to affirm that. Again, because the immediate need is to have clear statements and to abide by them. In the absence of any other policies, that is an appropriate way to begin. Yes?
Would you recommend that on the search for the pastor to know what his stance is before he's...
Oh, that's only one of many things. Again, this is another conversation for another session. But churches dare not assume that their pastors believe what the church believes. Churches dare not assume that the pastor is indeed Baptist. We have lots of folks that are pastoring and going into Baptist churches, and they're leading those churches out of traditional Baptist doctrine and out of cooperation and out of fellowship because they're not Baptist, or if they are Baptist, they're certainly not Southern Baptist, and so they don't understand how and why we do things together the way we do. And lots of churches are becoming independent, or who knows what, because the church made assumptions on the new pastor that were dangerous assumptions to make. Yes?
Now, maybe jumping ahead, as far as facility use goes, would it be wise for a church to put in their policy that only weddings that our pastor conducts can be used in the facilities so long as they correspond with his established policies?
Excuse me, I adjusted that got real loud, didn't it? That's one approach. Again, you can take numerous different approaches on this. Make sure that it fits your organizational policy. But yes, to have policies that refer one back to the other, that's right, they complement each other. That is good, and that's legally binding. What you don't want is to have statements in your bylaws regarding one section and policies in the other. Try to keep it all on the same level.
Thank you.
One question, get back to the basic, I guess. We have minutes that have policy in it, but we don't have the policy spelled out in any kind of manual. Is that a must, or?
What you have technically is legally binding. It's going to be hard to follow. That means anytime you have a question, you're going to have to dig out all of the minutes and make sure that there are no entries from 1940-something that contradict 1950-something that contradict 1990-something. This is the time to pull all that together into a single source. Good questions, good questions. All right, and thinking about your policies, again, focus on what you're for rather than try to spend a lot of time trying to outline everything you're against. I mean, let's be honest. If you're going to go to the congregation trying to list out every sexual deviation you can identify, you're going to have to explain what all those sexual deviations are. In mixed company, probably with children and youth. Is that where you really want to spend your time in a business meeting? Why don't we focus on what we're for, and again, let the counterfeits fall to the side. When you think of your policies, one of the things you want to keep in mind is that you have, for example, use of facility, and that would identify the groups that use a facility. This is not just a use of facility for weddings. This is the time to look at all the different uses of the facility. When you think of all of the uses of the facility, be careful. Some churches are making a knee-jerk reaction saying, well, we're going to limit the use of facility to members only. And then they say, oh, we forgot, we let the school do this, or we let the ball teams do that, or we let the Red Cross do this. Think about the totality of all of the uses of the facility, and think about why you allow other groups to use the facility. Because that why question will be important. If you can establish in your policy why you open the facility up to outside groups and what the expectations of these outside groups will be, when you have an outside group that you don't want to open it up to, then you can say, this is why we will not allow you to use the facility. But if you just have this blanket statement and you're not giving consideration to the why, if you leave that very subjective, that's not a good policy. A good policy answers the question not only of what you do and how you do it, but why you do it. So as you're thinking about the use of facilities and how you might limit that, make sure you answer that question, why? Why are we opening it up outside? So that we can identify to whom we're going to open it up outside. You don't want to be the pastor that called me recently and said, now, Brother Brian, we passed one of them their facility use policies. We said nobody can use it but members. But then we wanted the little league ball team to use it because, old brother so-and-so has been coaching that team all year. He's been loving those boys of Jesus, and he wants them to come and have this end of the year kind of cookout thing. And so we decided, even though the policy says that we've limited it just to members, since he is kind of a member, well, he's married to a member, well, okay, we've never seen him. Then we're going to make an exception. You do that to your own peril. If you establish a policy, follow it consistently. So that means you may want to take a little more time on the front end thinking about the why before you begin to limit those things. I'm trying to be very careful not to tell you exactly how you have to do your business, but to make sure that you've got a framework and some guidelines to help you as you establish these things. Are there churches that say for very good reasons that they only want to limit it to use of church members? Yes. Are there churches for very good reasons that say we want to get everybody in the community we can in here to try to engage with the gospel in one way or the other? Yes. And can both churches be good, organized, safely engaged in ministry churches? Yes. Because they have the power to establish those things as they deem best. Now, with your wedding policy, again, you've got facility use policy, that when it comes to the wedding portion, make sure your wedding policy doesn't contradict your facility use policy. I.e., and it can cut either way. Only members can use our facilities, but then you do weddings for non-members. Well, hold on. Something doesn't compute. Make sure that they agree with each other. Or you can say that we only will marry members and celebrate the weddings of members, but then you've got receptions and things for non-members. Make sure that your policies agree, both coming and going. And again, with your personal wedding position, you're always good to do that, to develop that, and you want to get the church to affirm it because you want it to come under the auspices of the ministry of the church. There's a big difference between being engaged in the ministry of marriage or the marriage business. Let me compare and contrast the two for you. If you're engaged in the ministry of marriage, then you're trying to help a young man and a young woman come together, blessed by God, having first each of them individually committed their lives to Christ so that you're equally yoking them. Then they come together with the understanding that they are not only in a husband and wife relationship, they're in a beautiful relationship that gives a picture and a display to the world of the relationship between Christ and His church. They're in this wonderful disciple-making relationship, especially if God chooses to bless them with children. They have this tremendous opportunity to be about the business of helping to facilitate a discipling relationship for children so that they become disciples of Christ who then engage their friends and others with the gospel. The marriage business just simply marries anybody to anything. And we got this nice facility, and we can make some money off of that. So let's just book this thing every Friday and Saturday, all spring and summer, so that we can have some good stuff going on here. When it comes to ministry, the church is free to determine to whom they will extend ministry. But if you're in the marriage business, you're like the two old boys out in Idaho. See, that's one of the little details that doesn't get told in that when that story gets reported. The two ministers in Idaho who are being sued because they refused to perform a same-sex wedding are not doing so through a church. They own a for-profit wedding chapel. Your freedom to determine who you will and will not marry is part and parcel of the separation of church and state. When you get out in the wedding business, because you're running a for-profit wedding chapel, while I disagree with this interpretation, because I think the Constitution says it protects the free exercise of religion, and I don't think that's only the exercise within the church, it's outside the church. That's my conviction. The reality is that's not how the law is being interpreted these days. The interpretation is if you're in the public forum competing with others in business, that you cannot discriminate. And so the reality is, if you're in the wedding business, you need to understand that you're going to be expected to operate by a different set of rules. Yes. Pardon?
Church preschools.
Church preschools.
Is that considered kind of like the two guys that have a full-time wedding business? Or is it all under the church?
Church preschools, depending on how you've organized it. If it is organized as a separate legal entity that's paying rent at your church, that may be viewed differently if there's a challenge, as opposed to a preschool that is under the umbrella and the ministry of the church, and it is accountable and responsible to the church. There's two different distinctions there. But there's always been a distinction between that which is considered educational in nature and that which is truly a for-profit entity. But good question, good question. Yes?
With 70% of scout troops being sponsored by churches in America, any thoughts on how to handle that?
Well, in the samples and templates that we provided, there also are some examples of some policies related to facility use as it pertains to scouts. Now, that was all written before the latest decision of BSA's executive board, which was to fully endorse the ability for folks the ability of homosexuals to be in those fully authorized positions. Before it was left up to each chartered organization, and now the national entity has made that pretty clear that the expectation is that that will be allowed. That's where a lot of churches are going to have to ask the hard question: is this something we're going to continue to engage in? Because this is a gray area. This is one of the pieces that has not fully been determined yet because there's not been any litigation that results in a precedent having been stated. But somebody somewhere is going to say no to a gay man in a scout troop. There'll be a suit over that, and then we'll be able to see what that's going to look like. But if I were a bet man, which I ain't, but if I were, I would imagine that the courts are going to say that because that is a separate entity meeting at the church, that the church doesn't have the full control over that entity, which is scouting and its decisions, which is enforcement. Yes?
So what you're saying is that the same principle with a church that has a daycare, the daycare has been incorporated, they are paying the church rent. Are you saying that we don't really have control, even though we got it in our use of facilities for that building, would we get in, is there a way we can get in trouble?
Depends on how you have it organized. If you have a separate legal entity that the church has a vested interest in, i.e. that the board that directs that group is comprised of church members, I mean, you've got a connection there, then there is a level of oversight that will be considered connecting it back to the church. And in that way, it's going to be considered a non-profit entity. If you get to a situation that you had a for-profit daycare that was set up in the church, there was no oversight, there was no governance, there was no connectivity whatsoever, that's the one that's probably going to create the issue. But there's still a number of ways, depending, and the churches organize daycare so differently. The safest way is for it to be fully under the management and authority of the church. But if you set it up wisely, you can have a separate entity, and I realize some churches do that because of liability purposes. You can still maintain a close enough connection that the preschool has, the daycare has the opportunity to make decisions much like the church would. But again, that is an example of one that you probably want to talk to an attorney about and make sure you worded things and organize things correctly. That's not as simple and clean cut because there's so many different ways that those get organized. And then what's going to get really stinky are those church-related daycares that are participating in the state's STAR program that results in the state evaluating the curriculum, and evaluating the policies and procedures, and awarding funding based on the reception of stars. You'll see, we're a 3-star center, a 4-star center. That's all part and parcel of a program that's operated by the state of North Carolina. At this point, the state has not been dictating what these centers have to teach, but the door is open for them to do so, and it's tied to the money that the state puts into those centers. That's where I see the first real challenge coming. And so for that reason, some churches refuse to participate in the STAR program. It means they don't get those monies, but it means that they have full freedom to dictate what they're going to teach and how they're going to minister to the children. Great question, great question. Yes?
When you were talking about marriage, pastors perform a lot of times, they wear 2 hats. There's the covenant of marriage, but then there's the civic responsibility, because after most marriages they say, and now by the power vested in me in the state of. How does that play into this in protecting us?
Well, at this point, remember the church was doing weddings long before the state ever intervened. And so until the state at some point says, we refuse to recognize the legal authorities of the ministers ordained and licensed in the churches to do weddings, and we refuse to allow their approval to represent the state. That may happen in the future. It hasn't happened now, and so there's no conflict on that. But that is a potential that I think we all need to be very cognizant of and pay attention to in the future. Because at this point, ministers are authorized to perform marriages that are recognized by the state. We're not required. And that's the difference between a minister and a magistrate. Is the difference between duty and authorization. Okay, great questions, great questions. All right, let's move from policies now. God's not giving us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power. And what's the next one? Spirit of love. What's love got to do with it? Well, here's where the presentation is going to take a little transition. Can we agree that the personification of love is seen and found in the person of Jesus Christ? Greater love hath no man than he do what? Lay down his life for his friends. God said, I no longer call you servant, but I call you friend. I will agree that to about that depth, that those that are engaged in all these different sexual relationships, where they say they are finally free to love each other, I will agree that they know about that much of love. But they don't know the depth of love. They don't know the height of love. They don't know the breadth of love. Because the only way to know the depth and the height and the breadth of love is to know love as created by God through a relationship with Jesus Christ. Amen. Now here's the problem. We live in a day and time where our society is determined that the people who love each other are not found in the church, but the people who love each other are the people who've now gotten the right to marry one another. And I submit to you that the doctrine of love, the message of love, the meaning of love, and the definition of love were all given to the church. And we've got to take our message back. We've allowed the world to take our message. We were given the message of love. We've allowed them to not only take it, they've redefined it. But here's the problem. And please forgive me. Before God called me in ministry, I was a public school teacher. And even more important than that, I was a high school horticulture teacher. And so I draw from those kind of illustrations and experiences from time to time. But when we teach basic horticulture, and you probably learned this when you took biology in about the 7th or 8th grade, we learned that God created plants in a unique way. They depend on photosynthesis for the development of their own energy and their own resources in order to grow and develop and to bear fruit. And God's created plants in such a way that they need to have light from across the light spectrum. And do you remember learning the light spectrum by learning a man's name? Anybody remember Roy G. Biv? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Now here's the reality with plants. If you expose a plant only to light from the red-orange spectrum of the color spectrum, it's stunted and restricted in its growth and it will not bear fruit. If you expose it only to the indigo violet rays of the spectrum, it grows tall and spindly, it doesn't develop any root, and it still won't bear fruit. That's why when you go buy a grow light, it has this unusual color about it because it has colors from across the color spectrum. Well, I submit to you that God has created love in much the same way. And we must preach and teach the doctrine of love in Scripture, understanding this truth. By that I mean, if we preach and teach the doctrine of love on one extreme, that is the red and orange extreme, if you will, and that is God is holy and God is righteous, and that is the most important thing about God, people often are restricted in their growth, and they don't bear fruit. But if we go to the other extreme, and we only preach and teach that God is grace and mercy, then they grow spindly, they have no root, and they don't produce any fruit. It's not either or. God is holy. He is righteous. He created marriage. He has holy and righteous expectations for it. Not only that the marriage bed be kept pure, which is very clearly stated in Scripture, but that our relationships prior to and during the marital relationship are to be pure. He speaks just as strongly about adultery as he does fornication in Scripture. I mean, we have high expectations, and those must be held up. But God has made it also clear He is gracious and merciful, and He realized that we're going to mess it up. And we often mess it up. Even those of us who stay married to the same person all of our lives, we still mess it up from time to time. And there's grace and mercy that's got to be taught and presented and preached, and it's got to be part of the disciple-making process. To err on either end of the doctrine of love is result in disciples who aren't bearing fruit. It's got to be the totality of grace and mercy, holiness and righteousness. I had a guy tell me this the other night, and I felt like such an idiot for not even seeing this. He said, Brother Brian, I don't know why you didn't bring this out. If we're going to keep things on love straight, you got God right there in the middle. Why don't you just focus on God? I don't know how many times I've had this presentation and just never seen the G in the middle of it all. And he made that connection, that Christ has got to be in the center of our doctrine of love. High and lifted up, holy and righteous. Make no bones about it, don't back down from that. But also, gracious and merciful and forgiving. It's not either or, it's both and. Now here's where the rubber hits the road when it comes to the issue that we're talking about with same-sex marriage. The church, and I'm not just picking on Baptists, I'm talking about a whole bunch of us, have stood by the statements for a lot of years that we hate the sin, but we love the sinner. Boy, there's a long distance between those two. And what's missing is this whole issue of value or respect. They don't simply value our position or respect us, and we've not done much good in valuing or respecting them as individuals created by God. And so we have to remember what Paul said to the church at Corinth. And if ever there was a church that messed up relationships, it was Corinth. What does 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 11 tell us? Whole list of people are not given to heaven, and most of them are relationship sins and sexual sins. Fornication and adultery, and depending on your translation, homosexuality and sodomy, and all these things are listed there. But he doesn't stop. What does he say? But such were some of you. But you've been washed, you've been cleansed, you've been justified, all by the blood of Christ. We have an opportunity to impact our culture in a great way with the message that God gave the church, the message of love. But we've got a lot of work we've got to do. We have a lot of ground to make up. Many people who are far from God are convinced we don't know anything about love. They don't know we were the ones that were given the message of love. They don't have a clue what the holy expectation is of the one who created them. Many of them would absolutely fall over if they knew, because they're wrestling, they're struggling with their identity. They would fall over and know that there's a God who wants to forgive them, cleanse them, get all of their relationships in order, and live to the fullness of how they were created. In some churches, the disciple-making process gets a lot of attention, but it gets separated from everything that we've been talking about. And this is where I want to move into the last point here. God's not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, love, and what's the third one? Sound mind. Now, I want to make sure that you don't think I'm contradicting everything I said about policies earlier. The immediate need for most churches is policy related. The immediate need for most churches is some form or fashion of policies that deal with facilities use, weddings, and as I mentioned earlier, maybe something about personnel. There are churches that want to make some kind of statement. We have expectations of our ministers that they will not participate in these kind of weddings, or they will only participate in these kind of weddings. Again, make sure you put all those in the appropriate places. Keep personnel in personnel policies. Keep wedding statements in a wedding policy. Keep facility use in a facility use. Link them together appropriately. And you're able to do that because God's given you a sound mind when you can do that. Don't throw up your hands and say, I can't do it, it's too hard. You can do it. You have folks that want to help you. You have a structure in your association that wants to help you. You have a structure in the state convention. We want to help you. This is part of the partnership process. This is part of the cooperative process. There are other churches in your community. You guys and gals need to work together. This is not too difficult. You can do it. It can be a great display of what cooperation really looks like for all the right purposes. And it's not simply to band together to insulate or isolate ourselves, but it's to make sure that we are moving forward with the gospel. This is not a time to retreat. This is a time to be very intentional, very wise, very gracious, very loving, but focused on holiness and truth all at the same time. That's the immediate need. But there's a long-term need that you do need to work on. And it's this issue that's found in most churches' bylaws. The long-term need is to look at your membership. Because most churches have something that sounds something similar to this. You can join this church by one of 4 ways. First of all, by profession of faith. And there'll be this beautiful, beautiful statement. Profession of faith in Jesus Christ, having recognized one's sin, confessed sin, repented of sin, giving evidence of a life transformed by the gospel, having put off the old man and put on, just beautiful statements. But then here's where the problem comes in. It says, or baptism. Or doesn't mean and. Or doesn't presuppose that everything you said about profession of faith is automatic with those that are coming for baptism. Next statement is, or by transfer of letter. Again, or doesn't presuppose that everything in that other church down the road or across the state or across the nation, that their position and belief and doctrines are all the same as yours. Don't make those assumptions that or equals and. And then the one I never have fully understood, or statement. Statement I want it. But we have these allowances for people to come into many of our churches by a statement. Well, first of all, start looking at how people come into the church. And make sure that you have tied to your expectations that yes, those who profess Christ have given evidence of a life transformed the gospel. And those that say they profess Christ but stand in need of baptism, that they give evidence of a life transformed the gospel. And those that come by transfer membership from some other church, that they've given evidence of a life transformed the gospel. Be consistent. Be consistent. But don't stop there. Then deal with the what. And what I mean by that is, what next? When somebody joins your church, what are the first steps that are taken to make sure that they are discipled, that they are in a disciple-making relationship, that they are growing as a follower of Christ? Here's the dirty truth a lot of people don't want to admit. In many of our congregations, there are already people who are members of our churches that are wrestling with some issue related to sexuality. They're engaged in a relationship, or they're questioning their identity, or they're struggling with some type of attraction. And more often than not, where it happens is we have a young boy or girl that grows up in the church. They profess Christ, they go through our disciple-making ministries, and they go off to school, and they get exposed to a variety of different things, and they come back with a whole different perspective on relationships than when they left. Now, they're already members of the church. The question is not how do you get them out of your church. The question is how do you get them into a disciple-making relationship that results in them being confronted with the truth of Scripture, the high and holy expectation of Scripture, of love, but graciously and mercifully helping them to understand you've got some things out of order. God wants you to get them in order. And we're here to help you get those things in order. This is the hard work. It's one thing to have a policy that details how people maybe outside the church might approach a request for a facility. This is the most important thing we need to deal with, is discipling those who are already part of our congregation, to make sure that they understand the expectations of Scripture, to make sure that they are living into those expectations. I won't call the name of a pastor, but a pastor of a very large, prominent church. Because the church is so large, he's developed a process to make sure that when a person professes Christ, they get matched up with a mentor who walks with them and helps them to grow as a disciple and follower of Christ. And it goes through all the beliefs and positions of the church, so that when they are baptized, they have confidence that this is a person who not only professes Christ, but believes as we believe. And because the church is so large, many times the pastor doesn't get a chance to meet each and every person before baptism takes place. So on one particular morning, there was a group to be baptized, and the pastor was getting to meet some of them for the first time. He discipled some, but a lot of them get discipled by other individuals. And so he's meeting a young man, some of his friends or family are there. And there's another young man come over the corner. The pastor says, "Who are you?" Expecting his brother, cousin, buddy. "Oh, I'm his partner." Now this is just minutes before the service is going to take place. So what does the pastor do? Does he just go ahead and do the baptism and try to clean it up later? Does he say no and run the guy out of the church? It's interesting. He said, "You know what? We're not going to do your baptism today. I know you've been working with so-and-so. I want to spend some time with you. And I want to make sure you understand the claims of Christ on every aspect of your life and every relationship in your life." I share that story because even in some of our good, well-organized ministries, over time we make assumptions. Somebody made a lot of assumptions. Either that the person who was being discipled understood the claims of Christ on every relationship in life, or assumed that the person doing the mentoring understood all of those things, or the assumption that the person doing the mentoring actually brought it up with the person being mentored. I mean, there's all kinds of assumptions that could have taken place. And the truth is, it probably was an overlap of all of that. So not only is it a good time for you to review all of your policies, this is a good time to review all of your processes for what it means to bring someone into the church, but more importantly, how to disciple them as followers of Jesus. And then the third part here is not just how someone comes to church and what takes place to disciple them, but this issue of when church discipline takes place. And we make a dangerous assumption when we say, well, we put Matthew 18 in our bylaws, so that explains how we do church discipline. No, that's the scriptural framework. How are you interpreting Matthew 18? Some people interpret Matthew 18 and say that's how we keep the church pure. We run off everybody that we disagree with. Well, when you get the church pure, please don't go back. It won't be pure if you show up. Please don't invite me. It won't be pure if I show up. We're never going to get the church pure. And I don't know that that's actually our scriptural mandate to get the church pure. Ministry requires risk, involves risk, and it means getting your hands dirty. And it means walking along some folks who've made mistakes. Others are cast off. Others think they are beyond the reach of the gospel. But the Holy Spirit convicts us that there are people who are not beyond the reach of the gospel. And we need to invest time in them. Even those who are members of the church and who've messed up. And others would say, well, that's an offense worthy of being dismissed from the church. Matthew 18 is not about getting people out of church. It's about getting people into the kingdom. It means that after we have followed a process of trying to help them address their sin, that we finally say, okay, it's obvious that you're living in sin in such a way, it's as if you have a testimony no longer. We're going to try to win you to Christ. The desire is this whole issue of this issue of treating them as if they were an unbeliever, to try to get them to a point that they recognize their sin, they'll confess their sin, and they'll come back into that right fellowship, first with Christ and then with His body. Now, is any of that easy? No. And because there's so many of us that have folks in our membership who are already wrestling with these issues, some already engaged in these issues, this whole issue of disciple making, the what, really needs to be driving our motivation for what we do, why we do it, when we do it, and how we do it. Some of the greatest ministry field we have is among our own membership. And it's because we've not been committed to the making of disciples. Or we've assumed somebody else was doing it. We were assuming it's always taking place in Sunday school. Or it's always taking place in training unit. Or we make the first assumption that it always takes place when people hear us preach. I guarantee you, people are discipled when they hear me preach. I wouldn't make that assumption. I wouldn't make that assumption. God's not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and love and a sound mind. There's some folks that are running around saying, the sky's falling, churches are going to start closing all over the place because same-sex marriage has been approved by the Supreme Court. Same-sex marriage is not going to close churches. There is something that's going to close churches. It actually has nothing to do with what's taking place outside. It's what's failing to take place inside. And it comes back to this what? It comes back to the issue of disciple making. Let me give you an example. I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but I used to teach horticulture, so I guess that counts as being a dresser of figs. But this idea that there is a day coming that another depression or recession is on the horizon. I'm convinced of that. I don't know what's going to happen. My crystal ball broke a long time ago, so I'm not going to try to prognosticate the future. But those who study economics realize that the recession that we've come out of, we're not fully out of, and we came out of it using economic models that are based upon bubbles that are going to burst. And so when that bubble bursts, municipalities, and it will start locally, are going to be wrestling and struggling to find the finances they need for basic services. And so they have the authority, and they'll probably use it to tap into a source of revenue they've never tapped into before. And that is to say that no longer will nonprofits be tax exempt for property purposes. And so it will be so reasonable, it'll be so logical. Well, churches ought to be good neighbors. Churches ought to be good members of the corporate community. And so you ought to be paying your fair share. And it's going to make lots of sense to lots of people, and we will be in the minority. And so we will lose that property tax exemption. Now, property tax shouldn't be a problem, except that we already have a problem. Our stewardship, which is part of the larger issue of discipleship, is so poor. We have so few people that actually give to the work of the church, and even a smaller portion of that actually tithe, that give a tenth. That so many churches operate on such a thin margin that all it's going to take is one more bill to push them from solvency to insolvency. It's very convicting to me. Jesus said to his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" Peter said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said, "Blessed are you, son of Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood's not revealed this to you. And upon that confession I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." But we may very well let property tax prevail against the church. Now is the time to use the sound minds that we've been given and to preach and teach not only the fullness and wholeness of the gospel, but to make disciples in fullness and wholeness. Stewardship is just one little slice of what it means to be a disciple. But we've got to be making disciples, including but not limited to being good stewards, so that when the day comes and when that property tax exemption is lost, the church will not be prevailed against by something as simple as a bill on a piece of property. And I remind you, the church was in existence for a long time in this nation before we ever had a property tax exemption. And we got along mighty fine without it. So why in the world are we potentially going to be faced with that difficulty? Again, it comes back not to pressure taking place outside, but a failure of what needs to be taking place inside, and that is the making of disciples. And so what we've been talking about this evening is far broader and really more important than policies. Yes, the government's given you power and authority to establish and recognizes the power and authority that God's given you to establish your policies and procedures. But those procedures that are most lacking in the church are more important than the use of facilities. It's the procedure and process we use in the making of disciples. That is the opportunity that stands before us. If we really want to see a change in the community, our policies are not going to change the community. Our disciple making will. If we really want to engage lost, our policies are not going to facilitate that. Disciple making will. If we really want to see the church strengthened for all of the difficulties that are coming in the future, and difficulties are coming, disciple making is going to make the difference. And please, please, please don't fall in this trap. Use your sound mind. Don't stand and preach and teach that the church is being persecuted in America. That is so disrespectful to our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world that are losing their lives because they are truly being persecuted. We are only now becoming uncomfortable. We're not being persecuted. None of us have to worry about walking out the front doors of our churches on Sunday and being greeted by masked and hooded terrorists who declare, renounce your faith or lose your life. But that's what happens to our brothers and sisters in Christ in many places around the world. But here's the question, what are you going to do in your discomfort? Are we going to throw up our hands and quit? Or are we going to retreat and try to isolate ourselves? Or are we going to be very intentional and very bold in our disciple-making efforts? Because that's where we have the opportunity to regain the ground that we've lost in our comfort and complacency. That's where we have the opportunity to expand the kingdom, the capital K kingdom, not my little k kingdom, but the capital K kingdom, is when we will get our focus on disciple making, on impacting the lostness of the making disciples. We've got an opportunity, and I pray that we use the sound mind God's given us and not miss this opportunity. Final thing that I'll share with you is that people say, where can I get resources? Well, certainly, Duke here in Tar River has got a lot of resources that are available on the association website. We want you to avail yourself of those. There are other places that we provide some resources at the convention. One of the places at the convention website, that's ncbaptist.org. Look down at the bottom of the page in the footer and you'll see church administration. And if you'll follow the church administration link, it will take you to a host of documents that will help you developing any number of church policies, including but not limited to a church policy manual that we've developed. Another place, if you're looking for specific resources to help you in dealing with facilities use, marriage policies, and personnel policies, you may want to go to the ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. They have been partnering with the Alliance Defending Freedom and developed some great resources. And early on, I was a little concerned, Alliance Defending Freedom, some of their resources early on were contradicting the things that we're saying, but now I'm glad to say that I'm seeing a lot of their newer resources are agreeing with the things that we've been saying in the state convention. So we want you to know that you can have confidence in all those resources and we hope that you utilize them. Another group that you may utilize is called the Liberty Council. They're out of Florida, and that is a law firm that comes to the aid of nonprofits, especially churches, to help them, whether it's policy, procedure, or even legal challenges that may come. I am working with an attorney here in the Raleigh area who's contacted our offices saying that they want to make themselves available to assist churches when and if challenges may come. I'm not at the point that we have I don't have all the information. I'm not going to endorse anybody yet, but I hope that very soon we'll be able to give you some names of attorneys that we've met with that we can say we have confidence in that they're going to be of good, valid and reliable assistance to you if you run into problems and feel that you need legal counsel. Any other questions or comments you have?
Great job.
Thank you again for being here. I know you've had a full day and I appreciate your time. I hope that as you're developing these policies and you have questions, you let Dougal know or other folks in your association, or call us at the state convention office. There's a group of us that are assisting churches. Even if you just want somebody to have an outside set of eyes just to review it to see if there's any gaps, we're glad to have you do that. Yes?
Being taped and video, will that be made available if you need it, like review and go through this process?
Dougal?
Did you get it on? We're going to have it available. We'll try to email everybody here that tells you how to link up to it. If you haven't signed that piece of paper,